Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Classical Antiquity Sidequest, a podcast covering topics from classical antiquity. The period of time is known for, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Our next side quest involves a discussion about gladiators in the Greek world. Turns out they weren't just for Romans or bad sequels. Anyway, our guide for this side quest is Alexandra Sills, an independent historian with a book on the topic that is about to come out. Miss Sills, how are you?
Very well, thank you. I'm
Well, thank you
delighted
for
to be here.
well, thank you for coming on. You almost had a guest appearance from our puppy. She came in for a second and then left. So I don't know if she's just not into the topic or what. She's a spaniel. She's got ADD. What can you do? So I don't know, but she may come back. We'll see. We will see. So, first time guests, I like to give them a chance to introduce themselves as if they were superheroes and provide their classics origin story. So, walk us through that.
It all started, I think, when I was a child, and my parents gave me a book on Greek myths when I was about 5. And then we went on holiday to Greece when I was 10. And we went on a tour, and I saw the Acropolis for the first time in real life. And I remember thinking, this is so enormous. And the tour guide was asking the group questions, and I was the only one to be able to answer them. And I fell in love with everything.
Okay, so you read a book and it took you onto the path that you're on now. But when you are on those tours, do you outshine the tour guide to the point where they get annoyed with you, or have you reined that back in? I ask because we were at there have been two instances where that has come up in my life. One, we were at the Mithraeum in London,
Hmm.
and these three people started talking about when Rome fell, and they had these dates of like they went with the historical 476, and I almost just snapped in and was like, "Let me tell you why you're wrong." But I'm like, these people are on vacations; they don't need to meet me like that. That's not really what I need to do. And then the other time, we were going to Hadrian's Wall, and oh gosh, I can't remember what part of it that we were going to, but the tour guide was saying nobody understood why Caesar came into Rome. And I was at the back of the bus and almost blurted out, "It was 10, for the love of God. He put it in the Gallic Wars. He let it
Yes.
slip." That was his one like error where he was telling people exactly why he was doing it, right? And so I didn't do that though. I caught myself. I caught myself. My daughter would never have forgiven me if I'd done that. But do you ever have those moments, and how do you handle it?
When I was a precocious kid, maybe, but I've been a tour guide since I was 16, right up until my 30s. And I still do it occasionally now, when I have an opportunity. And it drives me crazy when people do that because it's the equivalent of this is more of a comment than a question that you get in academic conferences, etc. And it's just a bit of a dick measuring contest. And I do not like it at all. So I will not correct any tour guide in any capacity at all, even if I know that they're wrong, because who needs it? Who needs that kind of
It's like when
the
my clients
confrontation?
tell me how to practice law or what the law is.
Yeah.
An interesting moment of that yesterday before we were recording this, but I think that's technically privileged, so I will not delve into that. But talk a little bit about your educational background before we get into a couple other things, including your podcast. But tell us a little bit about your educational background.
So I'm from the UK and I'm working class, and that means I went to what we call a state school. And that for me involved no ancient history past the age of about 9, because it's just not what is deemed important in UK state schools. You have to go to a very posh school that you pay for to get that kind of education. And in our country, that also means that when I was growing up, that was automatically a barrier to studying at a university. I didn't have a single teacher who knew how to get onto a university course studying ancient Greece or Rome because they didn't teach it. They didn't know anyone who studied it. And that was a bit of a problem because I adored it. And I thought that my background, working class, was going to stop me doing any of this. So, as I say, I worked as a tour guide, I worked in museums, some of the most prestigious museums and visitor attractions in the country, but they're not talking about ancient Greece or Rome. So, I was getting a little bit frustrated. And one day I went on holiday to Italy with two of my colleagues from one of these visitor attractions, and they were both archaeologists, like proper archaeologists with qualifications. And I didn't even have a basic certificate in anything to do with Greece or Rome. And I felt really, really nervous because we were going to Pompeii with the idea of Alexandra is the ancient Rome expert. She's going to tell us everything. So I did what every anxious person does, and wildly overcompensated. I ended up writing essentially a guidebook for visiting Pompeii and all of the sites around it. I had a spreadsheet of every single building in Pompeii and Herculaneum, every single piece of epigraphy, graffiti, complete with translations. And they sat me down very gently and said, "This isn't what normal people do when they go on vacation. Maybe
Clearly,
you
they've
should."
never seen my wife's travel spreadsheet guide for our
Yeah.
vacations. I don't think you're getting the best advice, but go ahead.
Yeah, they said maybe you shouldn't just be talking about a period of interest, a period of history that you're not interested in. Maybe you should go to university. And I said, I can't. Of course I can't. I didn't study the ancient world at school. And thankfully, they told me about a university in London that does accept students who have never studied the subject before, as long as they can show that they're going to be interested and engaged. So I went there in my 30s, and immediately it was like being given the keys to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. It was amazing. I was finally studying Greece and Rome away from whichever books that I could manage to find at the high street bookstores, properly talking to academics for the first time. I was so happy. So I've done 2 degrees now as a mature student. I don't think that I have the funding to go further, or given the job market the desire to go further.
I've been told the economy's great. I hear things like that constantly. So you might
Yeah.
be getting some bad facts. Let me just say, if you tune into Fox News and all those other places, you'll see everything's actually fine.
I mean, I have a daughter, so I have responsibilities. I think doing a PhD probably quite an irresponsible thing for me to do. So I am going down the public history route, which I can do without a PhD. And that's how I'm keeping myself happy and fulfilled. And my God, am I? It's been life changing.
How two things I wanted to ask about. And we're already side questing, but I promise we will get to gladiators. You talked about going on that trip and being super prepared. I guess they would call that, is this something I see a lot like on LinkedIn and some other places, this term imposter syndrome that comes around, like
Yeah.
you want to, but if people say that like it's a bad thing. And as somebody who, it sounds like we had a similar background, as you can see, the audience can't, but I'm wearing one of my College of Charleston t-shirts where I went to school, and I went until I went to law school. I'd gone all through public schools. Um, it gets kind of a bad rap, but I feel like when people were describing what that was, I was like, well, those were things that I did, and it does work out, and it actually worked for you because it steered you, where you wanted to be. Um, I want to some extent, I guess it kind of gives you the chip on your shoulder you need to succeed or focus or be, I don't want to be shown up. I want to be prepared for this. And I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And then two, how long does it take to get a PhD in England?
Okay. So, firstly, I think imposter syndrome has absolutely helped me. The anxiety doesn't feel nice, but the knowledge that I have to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously really has made me work absolutely as hard as I can to produce the best work that I can. I'm fully aware that without those fancy qualifications, without the doctor in front of my name, that I'm going to be scrutinized harder. I'm not going to be trusted as much. So it really has forced me to make sure that my work is as bulletproof as possible, which I think only makes the work better. And for a PhD in the UK, I'm looking at least 4 years full time, which without funding and with a family is just not possible.
It's interesting what you said about the anxiety. I remember the first time. So when I was in law school, the summer of your second year is when you go usually work at a place that you try to latch on to when you finish after your third year of law school and you start practicing law. So your summer job after your second year is the key one usually to starting your legal career. I remember we had this thing that you could do where it was called third year practice certified. So over the summer, I can't remember what it was, but I'd taken certain types of courses, and I think maybe you had to take evidence. I don't remember, but you could get a certificate that would allow you to practice as an attorney under the supervision of an actual attorney. And so I'm arguing this motion in actually in the well, technically a city, but in the county courthouse. I don't want to get into the city county distinction in Virginia on here. We don't need to side quest into that. But the county courthouse where I was going to law school, and I was appearing before Judge Irvin, who I know very well now. And so it was the first time I'd ever argued anything, and not coming from a family of lawyers or a background of lawyers, you're not really sure what to do. And I remember at some point as I was talking, I was going through it, I just said to the judge, I was like, Your Honor, if I could just take a second here, I'm a little nervous. This is the first time I've ever done this. And he said, That's totally fine. Take whatever time you need. And I just took like a second for a breath. And I remember that, I guess, level of anxiety, but also saying, All right, this is what I'm dealing with. I'm just gonna tell the court this. And then after that, everything was on cruise control and it went fine, but it was interesting. You talking about anxiety made me think about that. Let's switch gears a little bit because I think I had come across you as a result of your podcast, and some senior academic, I think as Dr. Jeremy Swiss said, number of days without a senior academic punching down on a junior academic about the name of the podcast.
Yeah.
But which anyway, whole thing there. But tell us a little bit about your podcast.
So the podcast is called Ancient History 101. And yes, I am aware that the name is very broad. However, as I say in the first episode, the ancient history of the Mediterranean, including Greece, Rome, Carthage, etc., etc., etc. Too long, can't fit it into a logo. So
Won't
yes.
look good on a coffee mug or a t-shirt, that's for sure.
However, when we talk about ancient history with the general public, it is a fact that, and this is something that classics has caused itself, that most people go to Greece and Rome when we say ancient history instead of, say, China or the Aztecs. So I am taking advantage of an issue that classics has created itself. So don't come at me for it. Come at scholars that have come centuries before us. And it's essentially a show that's designed for people like me 10 years ago who did a different degree because it was going to be more economically viable for them to do a sensible degree, but they really love listening about ancient Greece and Rome, who maybe couldn't study it formally at school, who don't know that there are access to get mature degrees without the qualifications, but who just really want decent content that's with academic experts, in depth, that doesn't patronize, that goes into the context and into the nuance instead of giving a superficial narrative, which I think is a bit of an issue, particularly in TV documentaries at the moment. There's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of superficial nonsense. I think that the general public can absolutely deal with some more rigorous discussion. So it's a podcast for me 10 years ago. Absolutely. I would have loved this kind of show that is for people who haven't got a degree or are perhaps just coming into a degree. So they might not have that level of background knowledge that other people have that listen to these more niche and advanced podcasts, but that still doesn't treat them as if they can't cope with discussions that go into these details.
And there are a lot of very interesting topics on there. I've listened to one episode and I intend to listen to more. However, Dr. Jen Garish has started me on, and I tried to read the Antiquities of the Jews. Could not read it. Translation was awful.
Mm-hmm.
For the love of God, people, use a period. Okay. Use a period. Make the sentences shorter and easy to understand. So I got an audiobook version of it. I have listened to 26% of it so far, and I still have 37 hours and 59 minutes left.
Yeah,
It is
it's
taking some time. I think I just got through Samson. All right, but I'm making progress. But one of the things that is interesting about your podcast though is the variety of subject matters that you have. You have a couple episodes on Augustus. You have an episode about the 30 tyrants, which is something that I would like to cover at some point. Slavery in the Roman society, Trojan women, uh, the mechanics of museums themselves. There's a lot for people to listen to and
mm-hmm.
digest.
I think that when you get to university to study antiquity, very, very quickly, within a year or two, we're told you need to start focusing in on Greece or Rome. And then after you've made that decision, we need to start focusing in on literature or archaeology or military history or whatever it is. We're pressured to specialize, specialize, specialize. But for the general public, they don't need to do that. They don't want to do that. The amount of PhD theses that are really niche and narrow is fantastic for academia. That's not going to translate to the general public. So I wanted to create a show that covers a little bit of everything. So there will be people who listen to every episode, and that's great. There will be people who only cherry pick literature, etc. It's hopefully going to appeal to everyone for at least one episode. And I think that by covering a little bit of everything, it doesn't restrict me in the same way that, for instance, doing a PhD would. Because I certainly think that during my degrees, I didn't get to cover everything that I would have liked to. So it's a little bit selfish, really. I'm creating a show that allows me to have a seminar session with an academic on any subject that I choose, including things that I didn't get to cover myself at university. I get to be an eternal student without the fees, without the exams, and bring along everyone with me so that we can cover absolutely everything that crops up and never feel restricted. So I'm excited about it. I really like that we have a diverse slate of episode topics. It I could have gone something more specific, but I think I would have felt a bit limited.
Well, I think being a generalist podcast and having a generalist approach to it is not a bad thing because it will help you as you continue to study and read these things. One of the things that keeps cropping up on this podcast is the lack of interdisciplinary communication and these sort of historical
Mm-hmm.
myths that crop up as a result of it. So I'm all for it. I think it's great. And speaking of great things, you have a book coming out,
Mm.
Gladiators in the Greek World: How a Roman
Yeah.
Blood Sport Took Ancient Greece by Storm. First off, congratulations. Second, where did the idea for the book come from?
It came from my favorite hobby, which is traveling to see as many ancient sites as possible, walking around and thinking, oh, that's odd. And this happened about 10 years ago when I was in Argos and I was visiting the theatre for the very first time. And I noticed these strange holes in very equal spacings all around the orchestra. And thinking, what are they for? That's odd. And on the sign, it had just a throwaway comment, the holes are for gladiators. And I thought, oh, I didn't know that the Greeks had gladiators. That's a Roman thing, right? And the same year, I went to France to see a recreation of a day at the Games in an amphitheatre in Nîmes. They do it every single spring. They open up the amphitheatre and they have gladiator reenactors. They have a full-on battle reenactment, sometimes with ships, which are on wheels that are hidden. They're not actually floating, but you get the idea. And the experience of being in a group of tens of thousands of people watching this spectacle, I thought, oh, right, I get it now. I understand. So I started to think, well, I live in a country, Britain, which has got dozens of amphitheatres. They are everywhere. You don't have to go very far to see a Roman amphitheatre at all. But when I go to visit Greece, I don't see them. Are they there? So I started to wonder, where are the gladiators? And I found 2 books and a PhD thesis that gave me the answers, but they were very partial. So the first book was from 1940. It was just epigraphy and it was all in French, which was a bit of a struggle for me. All in French, and the author, Louis Robert, just talks about inscriptions, and he doesn't like gladiators, which permeates everything that he writes about them. He calls them a disease that Rome infected Greece with. And then there's a PhD thesis, which is, again, epigraphy, and a book from 2011 in German, which is, again, epigraphy. And they talk about these hundreds of inscriptions, which is very interesting. And I've done a little bit more work on that myself, but I'm thinking there's got to be something archaeological there as well. And I remembered those holes in Argos Theatre. So I started to wonder, does anyone else have holes in their theatres, or do they have something else? And I found walls built for gladiatorial combat and to make it safe for spectators. And I realized that there are dozens of theatres and stadiums that have these adaptations, but no one was talking about them. They're very, very infrequently written on the signposts. They're not in the guidebooks. And when I started looking in the archives, they're not really mentioned in archaeological reports either. You might get a footnote saying there's a wall for gladiators, but it won't have a date. It won't have any kind of analysis at all. It's almost like this is something that the archaeologists don't want to talk about because this is a theatre and it's pure, it's for beautiful tragedy. They don't want to think of it as tarnished by gladiators, which ironically is something that many Athenian writers were saying themselves. But the more I looked, the more evidence I found, not just epigraphy, and I realized the volume of material that I had, this was giving the impression that there was a huge love of gladiators in the Greek world, but for some reason, very few people were talking about it. So I thought, I'm going to talk about it.
So, talk a little bit about the sources of information for your book. You talk about a lot of different things. There's primary sources, there's inscriptions, and then there's archaeologic digs that turn up these venues, like you were talking about. So, talk about where your main sources of information came from as you put the book together.
So inscriptions are a large part of it because that's by far the largest pile of evidence that we have is the gladiatorial inscriptions from, for instance, advertisements for games, funerary gravestones, and commemorative reliefs as well, which weren't put up for dead gladiators necessarily. They were put up by people who wanted to commemorate specific gladiators or fights. But there are also hundreds of small finds, which I haven't really been catalogued all together yet. They've been mentioned in specific circumstances regarding to the place that they were found, but not really in contrast to similar finds elsewhere. So we have souvenirs from gladiatorial games, such as little dollies, terracotta lamps with gladiators on, hundreds and hundreds of them, pieces of graffiti and mosaics in houses of gladiatorial fights in the Greek world. So art was a huge part of this because, again, no one really was talking about it as a whole yet. These mosaics may have been mentioned in passing, but no one's really talked about them properly all together from the Greek world.
Yeah, which was one of the things that I noticed when you got into the historical analysis of why gladiators were so popular. It
Mm-hmm.
seemed like some of that was written by people who don't care for or don't understand sports very much.
Yeah, I
And
think that's true.
I could see kind of a breakdown on maybe putting that all together.
I think there's two issues. Is that, and this, to be fair, mirrors the ancient world entirely, because the people that write about this the most are usually the people that hate it. And they're talking about why they hate it. And that's the same now as it is then. The educated sophisticates love to complain about gladiatorial combats as they do with similar sports because they see that being a sports fan isn't very sophisticated. There's these huge shows of emotion, for instance. That's not particularly elegant. Being in a crowd, these are the same things that the ancients were worried about. The effect on crowds that sports and the emotions that come from sports has. And it really did strike me as well that there are certain historians who will either pretend that gladiators don't happen because they don't want to talk about something that they find distasteful, or they refuse to properly think about why gladiators existed in the first place because they find them distasteful, and therefore they'd rather just sweep them under a rug. But I would argue that I don't particularly find them tasteful. I don't want to see men fight to the death, but I find it fascinating that they did. And therefore, I have questions about it. I want to be curious about it. I don't want to pretend it didn't happen. And I certainly don't want to sit here pontificating and saying, I am better than the Romans because they had gladiators. I wouldn't want to see them myself. I'm a better kind of person because I don't think that's particularly true.
And so let's talk a little bit about, I'm going to deviate from the script, but as far as why gladiators became so popular in the Greek world, there's the entertainment factor. But one of the things you talked about is it seemed like it was easy to find places to put on these events.
Yeah.
And as I was reading it, that was it. Before you kind of got to that point, I was thinking to myself, well, I it wouldn't take a whole lot to put it on. It's not like you have to, fill up the Coliseum with salt water to bring in the sharks, which we know happened from Gladiator 2,
Oh, yeah.
but 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 talk a little bit about why you think that it became so popular in Greece, as opposed to maybe some other types of sports.
Sure. So, and I think this is something that's an issue when you silo antiquity being studied, with the Romans being studied by one group of people and the Greeks being studied by the other. We think a lot about their differences culturally, but it can be maybe a little bit more challenging to see where there's overlap when we're so siloed away from each other. Because there has been this assumption that the Romans loved gladiators because they were all militaristic brutes, and that the Greeks would not love gladiators, and it was a disease that infected them because they wouldn't like things like that. They're all bearded philosophers, sitting in a stoa, reading some epic poetry. But have you read Greek epic poetry? There's battles on every page, one-on-one battles where people are dying in horrific ways. That's what an arena is. Um, if you look at Greek athletics, which we find so fascinating that we've revived it in the modern Olympics, those contact sports events, the wrestling, the boxing, the pankration, pankration has two rules, which is no biting and no eye gouging. Trying to snap someone's limb in half was an absolutely approved of way of winning a pankration match. There were people that died in these matches. We know this, we know their names. So the Greeks grew up with, hundreds of years before they knew Rome existed, they grew up with epic poetry that had epic duels between warriors. They had plays where we talk about these ancient warriors, again, having these combats. And they're also going to sanctuaries like Olympia, Delphi, etc., to see men really hurting each other on purpose as a competition and thinking of it as entertainment. So when you give them gladiators, when you give an ancient Greek a gladiator, he's an amalgamation of things that are already incredibly Greek. The idea of competition, the idea of physical strength being beautiful, the idea of the militarism. Essentially, it's like taking Homer and the Olympics, mashing them together, and voila, you have a Roman gladiator. And the Greeks very quickly see this and think, yeah, we like it. We can understand it. They maybe didn't take on all of the Roman ideology of the arena because they had their ideology that they could already insert into it. It didn't take a lot at all for the Greeks to fall in love with Roman gladiatorial combat because it was already a mashup of all of these things that they loved. And I think that this is one of the reasons why Greece, Turkey, Cyprus, they don't have a lot of amphitheatres. Yes, okay, it's a very Roman building. And there is an issue with this. It's very large, very visual statement of Rome being in your city now. They're very expensive to build. There's that issue. But I actually think that the Greeks preferred to stage their combats in theatres and stadiums because the theatres and stadiums were where they were listening to Homer being recited, where they're watching these plays with Eteocles and Polynices. The stadium is where they're watching pancratiasts rip each other to shreds. These spaces already have combat embedded into them. So why not just have gladiators there as well? Not as part of the existing festivals. They didn't incorporate them into the Olympics and they didn't incorporate them into tragic festivals. Why would you? But they were absolutely seen, quite rightly, I think, as a viable venue that needed very, very little done to it. They've already stood there for hundreds of years. Why not?
So fewer rules than Fight Club, even in the
Yeah, exactly.
right. But you mentioned this, the epic poetry, and I was thinking about you have a whole section about the names of gladiators, and they
Yeah.
just kept invoking Greek epics. Talk a little bit about that.
So we have the names in epitaphs and in graffiti of nearly 400 Greek gladiators, not only of their names that they're calling themselves in their epitaphs, but they often mention their colleagues or their opponents. So we have so many names. And it's interesting that out of these 400, only two are Latin names. A lot of them are using the same kind of Greek names that we would imagine that have a meaning. We have a lot of kalos, beautiful. So they're describing themselves, they're describing their attributes in the same way as a normal Greek would. But what's really interesting is between about 20 and 25% of these men and indeed a couple of women, they're choosing their stage names directly from Homeric epic and other myths. They're choosing the names of heroes and warriors in the same way as you could imagine a wrestler now choosing to call himself Superman. Same kind of thing. It automatically gives the audience an idea of this is what this guy's skills are going to be, this is what his demeanor is going to be like, by taking on the role of these existing heroes that everybody was familiar with. So if you're going to call yourself Achilles, you automatically not only align yourself with that hero, but you're also advertising your own skills and setting audience expectations that this is going to be an extraordinary fight because you have named yourself after an extraordinary Greek warrior. And what it means is that theoretically, a Greek could go to the theatre one day and see a play about two heroes having a battle. And then a week later, they could go to that very same theatre and see two gladiators fight that battle in ultra realism. So, in a way, I've called it Homeric cosplay because I think that's kind of what it is. When we think about the epics themselves, they discuss violence very, very graphically. The play is not so much because it all happens off stage. But the Greeks were not averse to hearing about the physical trauma of war and the weapons used and what they could do. So now they got to finally see it as a form of entertainment. Essentially, it was like the invention of television, even. You've read about these fights, now you can see them.
In regard to how popular the gladiator fights were, your book details how Roman politicians would use gladiator games to curry favor with the people. Can you
Mm-hmm.
talk a little bit about that? And of course, Caesar being kind of at the forefront of that to some extent.
Yeah, in Rome itself, gladiatorial combat evolved through the funerals of great men. They started off being for consul funerals. These, as consuls, they were already military generals. And the very first one, we're told, there were some prisoners of war that were from this deceased man's conquests. And someone had the bright idea, why not just present these prisoners of war? Why not make them fight as well? And there's a discussion about whether that counts as human sacrifice. I don't think it does. But it's definitely in Rome a very bold statement of we are military, we conquer, and we control those that we conquer. The prisoners of war, we can do whatever we want with them. We're going to make them fight for our entertainment. So for a long time, this happens purely at funerals. Julius Caesar comes along, and as we know, he's an innovator in a lot of ways. And he starts thinking a little bit outside of the box. His father died when he was quite young. And in the year that he gets one of his early magistracies, where he's the one in charge of helping people create these gladiatorial combats for their ancestors' funerals, he decides, well, I'm going to do one. Why not? This is my year. Unfortunately, inconveniently, nobody he knew had died. For a funeral, you tend to need a dead person.
It would help.
So he decides, I'm going to give a funeral games for my father, even though he's already been dead for 20 years. So he innovates by taking advantage of the situation. He's at a crucial point of his career. Why not put on the thing that everybody loves about funerals because they're becoming insanely popular? Let's put on the famous bit that everyone loves, even though technically it's not a funeral. And that starts the move away from gladiatorial combat being purely used for funerals and it being a tool of currying favor with the voting public.
And one of the things,
Augustus,
oh, go
oh,
ahead. I'm
sorry,
sorry. No, go ahead.
Augustus very quickly realizes I don't need anyone competing with me. He's seen what happens to Caesar when people try to compete with him. He doesn't want that kind of competition. So in Rome, he locks that down. So he is the only one who's allowed to give games. But when you start going out into the provinces, and this is true of the Greek world as well, it's magistrates, including local ones who are working with the Romans. It's their responsibility to put on the games, and that's what we're seeing in the Greek world.
And then there were some legislative responses, it seemed like, to how popular these things had become. And you talk about price controls sort of for the shows themselves, but you also
Yeah,
talk about how Cicero had to stick up his rear end about it. Can you talk about that a little?
Cicero absolutely had to stick up his butt because he saw what Caesar was doing by moving these combats away from the funerals and using them as a manipulative tool. He very, very savvily worked out that this could be exploited with devastating effect. So one of his rules was to try and minimize how much you could use gladiatorial combats outside of the funeral uh, space. And as gladiatorial combat becomes more and more popular, they become more and more expensive. People expect a bigger game each time. You've got to keep on growing as the audience expectations are growing. No one's going to go to some podunk little show when last year you gave them this extraordinary spectacle. So everything has to keep getting bigger and bigger and grander and grander. And that comes with a cost. Someone has to pay for this. It gets to the point where it's not just the emperor, it's the magistrates in every single town that has a gladiatorial troupe visiting it. Someone has to pay. And because giving a gift in Rome, a munera, in Greece, philotimia, this giving a gift as part of your magistracy, which could take multiple forms. You could help build an aqueduct, you could give an athletic festival. You had to give your town something out of your own pocket as part of that role. You soon get people saying, I can't afford to give gladiators because they're becoming more expensive than building a monument. However, the people are demanding gladiators, in some cases, instead of a monument. They'd rather have the ephemeral one-day event than a building that's going to potentially adorn their city for centuries. So it's a case of supply and demand. The people really want their magistrates to give them gladiators. The magistrates want to give them gladiators because they want to be re-elected and they want the prestige. On the other hand, not if it's going to bankrupt them. So yeah, they had to bring in rules about how much you could charge for a gladiator simply because the price gouging was getting out of control.
Not at all dissimilar to trying to get World Cup tickets at the moment, from what I understand.
Exactly.
Which I am not going, but my wife and son are. They are going to see, not sure when this will air, but they're going to see Brazil and Haiti play in Philadelphia. I think they had to go through like the hospitality suite thing, and it's sort of a blind auction. You have no idea who you're going to see. It just happened to work out for them. But
Yeah.
you were talking about the rules for these games as far as putting them on and who would pay for them. We think of gladiator games probably as a result of movies as blood sport, fights to the death, and that things that people would not survive, that someone would always die at the end of these. But there were actually referees, and you talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
Explain that process a little bit to the extent that we have a workable knowledge base of what the referees would do.
So I wish we had a rule book surviving. That would make my job a lot easier. Unfortunately, we don't. So we have to reconstruct as much as we can. This is where mosaics come in really handy because, particularly in the Greek half of the empire, the mosaics tend to feature the referee quite prominently. So we know that he was in the action. He was stood right next to the gladiators as they were fighting. He had a long staff, and he would have been able to stop the fight by bringing down that staff in between the two fighters. We know that there were rules. They seem to maybe change over time. Certainly, certain emperors decided to change some rules that they did or did not like. So, for instance, there's an idea that if a gladiator fell on his back, then the match was paused and they waited for him to be able to get back up onto his feet before they could continue. So the referee would be the one to stop the fight and say, look, this guy's fallen over, you wait. When I say go, you can start going again. So the referee was really, really important. And we actually have the names of some of the Greek referees because of the inscriptions, including one guy who went on tour of seemingly the whole of the Greek world as a referee, performing in multiple venues. He was given the freedom of several cities. He was a big deal. People would have seen him as much of a celebrity as they did the gladiators themselves. So yeah, it's interesting. I wish I could tell more, but this is as much as I can reconstruct until we find another inscription that gives us a bit more detail.
One of the other maybe misconceptions, possible misconceptions that you get into in the book relates to the body habitus of the gladiators. Use the term flabiators, I think.
Yeah.
That it's unclear, whether they were Kit Harington in Pompeii, which had a gladiator storyline in it for reasons that still remain unclear to me, but whatever. Although the end of that movie was amazing. The scene of a volcano explode will always up the quality of whatever movie you're watching. But there's some thought that maybe they were a little bit bulkier across the midsection. What kind of ideas are we able to tell maybe what their typical build would have looked like, or is it just still in dispute?
So on this, all we have to go on is artworks, and we do have a small sample of osteoarchaeological evidence, which comes from the Greek world. And this idea of fat gladiators comes from one of those osteoarchaeologists, actually, working in Vienna. They discovered this graveyard in Ephesus where they found skeletons right next to gravestones. And not only did the gravestones identify these men as gladiators, there's no argument about this. They're right next to each gravestone. These are in situ. So we know the names of some of these skeletons, which is astonishing. We also get to study their bones. And I'm not an osteoarchaeologist, obviously, but I have read everything that I can get my hands on. And one of the osteoarchaeologists gave an interview, I think, to a magazine, which wasn't in his first language, which I think is relevant because he says that the gladiators would have bulked up to get through fights and to give them a form of protection against hits by swords. I do have two issues with this. The first is that the magazine certainly ran with it and said gladiators were fat. Whether or not this Austrian speaking in a second language meant fat or just not 0% body fat, that's up for debate. And there's definitely a difference between stocky and obese.
Mm-hmm.
So in the book, I've described it as maybe we should stop thinking of it as fat and more of the build of a rugby player or an American footballer, someone who's bigger, and they're definitely not skinny, but they're not fat. They're big, but they're not fat.
I still
Two
wonder.
reasons.
Yeah, you got into this too. It was how much an extra layer or maybe a little bit higher body fat percentage would really protect you from a sword hitting your
Yeah,
abdomen.
we've got to think about what they were fighting with, which in the most cases is a gladius, or the Greeks. From the artwork, we think they preferred the shorter sword. Either way, these are deadly, even at a couple of centimeters. So even the most morbidly obese man, if he gets a stab wound from one of these, it's, good night, right? So the idea that has kind of sprung up is that they would be able to aim at each other purposefully and give deliberate wounds that would give a theatrical spurt of blood that could easily be fixed by a medic afterwards to add drama to a fight. So this leads on to the idea that fights were fixed and that they were choreographed, which I reject entirely. I think the Greek gladiators would have been horrified at the thought that they choreographed their fights in advance. They did have medics, but I think when you look at the skeletons that we have and the wounds that they received, there are going to be a few wounds that can potentially be stitched up. There are a lot that couldn't. We know that these are fatal wounds. I think that the idea of being chubby so that a gladius isn't going to fatally wound you is not feasible. It just doesn't make any sense. And one of the things that really makes this idea seem even more ridiculous is the work of Carter, who has looked at some of these inscriptions, and he's noticed this word that gets put into some of these inscriptions that are advertising games, where he points out that they specify that the swords are sharpened. Why would you specify that if it's a sword? They're sharp, right? But he's taken the word in its original Greek, he's interrogated it, and he's worked out that they mean the point of the sword is very deliberately sharpened, not necessarily the blade. And this matches up with the work of experimental archaeologists who have taken gladiatorial swords, their arms and armor, and tried to learn how to fight using them in a way that makes sense. And we've got this idea from Hollywood that there's a lot of hacking and slashing. However, that doesn't really work when these people are reenacting gladiatorial fights, because every time you hack and slash, you're leaving your side exposed. And also it makes the shield almost pointless. It makes more sense that you're poking with a sword rather than slashing with it. So if a sword tip was sharpened, that does make the fight more dangerous. And that's why it's being mentioned in the advertisements. This is a high risk game. This one is going to be the adrenaline pumping game that you're going to watch, which does suggest that most of the time the tip was not sharpened, maybe not completely blunt, but definitely not razor sharp, to try and minimize damage, because it does seem that there was a huge incentive to minimize damage to the gladiators themselves.
And that one other thing I wanted to ask you about, how common do we think the Without Mercy games were? You touch on that a little bit in your book, that was a style of games that were put on.
Yeah, Without Mercy. Excuse me, I'm going to cough a little bit. The Without Mercy games, I think they seem to be quite rare. And again, the way that we can tell this is from a lot of epitaphs. These gentlemen are very, very keen to specify how many times they've fought. And for the majority of them, the average is around 12 combats each. Even if we take into account that they're the ones with the more successful careers, in that they've earned enough money from their career to afford a gravestone, this gets rid of the idea that all fights must have been no mercy, because a 50-50 chance is not going to lead to some of these gentlemen having careers of, in one case, 50 fights. It's just not going to happen. But also we have epitaphs from gladiators who specify, I caused no harm to my opponents. There seems to be a gentleman's agreement of we're going to give a display of martial prowess without trying to kill each other. Because why would you? It seems that death isn't the point. Death is sometimes a consequence, but the audience isn't there to see death. They're there to see two maestros of combat give a display of excellence. We do know, obviously, particularly from the gravestones and the archaeological evidence, that death did sometimes happen. I think that a lot of the cases of men dying in the arena, and again, the evidence backs this up, is that if they lost a fight, they would be killed afterwards, not during. The referee would probably stop during. And then the gladiators were trained to accept the death blow from their opponent, usually kneeling with a sword being driven into them. And they were taught to not flinch when this happened. And I think that sometimes this is when a gladiator failed to impress and to do his job and therefore didn't deserve to continue his career. But I think also it must have been in a lot of cases that this guy had received wounds that they knew couldn't be healed. And this was more of a mercy killing rather than a punishment killing. The reason that I think that no mercy fights were quite rare is the price of gladiators. Because, as I say, they were astronomically expensive, even after these prices were regulated as much as they could be. Because the method was, it was priests of the imperial cult usually putting on the games as part of their role. So they leased gladiators. It was very rare for the imperial priests to have their own stable of gladiators. The ones in Pergamon did, for instance, and they inherited it from the priests that came before them. But otherwise, you had to find a Lannister, an owner, and lease out the gladiators. And that Lannister had a list of prices of what he would charge. Excuse me. Certain ranks of gladiators were more expensive than others. Certainly the veteran ones became more and more expensive the more advanced they became. And it was a case of, if you kill a gladiator, that's no longer a rental price. That imperial priest has to pay the Lannister what the gladiator was worth total. So that's purchase price. He's also compensating for the money that that person has invested into this gladiator, the food, the board, the training, the loss of future income. So when you have every fight ending with death, that now makes a games so expensive that they would not be able to be put on ever. To have the kind of games that we're seeing with multiple pairs of gladiators fighting for a whole day, it's not financially feasible for one man to be able to pay for the worth of half of the gladiators. So a lot of it is financial. The gladiators don't want to harm themselves. The gladiators don't want to harm each other out of professional respect unless they absolutely have to. And in some cases, they make a point on the epitaphs of saying, this guy tried to hurt me. How dare he? That's not the gentlemanly way of doing this. He was out of bounds by being bloodthirsty. So that gentleman's agreement of do as little harm as possible while putting on a good show. But also the price of the gladiators' deaths was so much that there was not an imperial priest in the place who would have said, let every single match be to the death because I'm Mr. Moneybags and I can afford it all. It would have bankrupted them.
A couple things I want to close on here. You have a lot of interesting facts in the book. One, somebody researched how many people were injured or died from spears in the Iliad. I thought that was an interesting
Yeah.
thing to do. There's a lot of others in there, but one of the kind of unsettling things that you discuss was sort of this ongoing fascination with I'll just use the term blood sport, violence, seeing it, watching it. And you talked about how some civilians have set up viewing platforms while watching bombs being dropped in Gaza, uh,
Yeah.
which I had not heard about, and that was unsettling to hear about that's existing, or that is occurring and going on. Um, but one hopefully more less unsettling and not at all unsettling thing that you talked about was how Athenian playwrights would make Athens a major player in the Trojan War at one point. Can you talk a little bit about that? I just thought that was an interesting sort of instance of hype work on the part of Athenian playwrights.
When the Iliad was being formed as an oral tradition, Athens was not a major player in Bronze Age Greece at all. It was a bit of a backwater. When we finally start to see the Iliad being crystallized in its final form, if you will, with a canon version that's written down, Athens has started to become more prominent and thinking to themselves, there's this great poem about all of these Greek warriors and we're not in it. That's unfortunate. We're the greatest city in our own opinion, and we're not mentioned in this war hardly at all. So, for instance, in Euripides' Trojan Women, which is about the Trojan royal family, the queen, the princesses, who have been captured after the fall of Troy, and they're about to be escorted to Greece as concubines for the Greek heroes. And they've each been assigned a hero that they're going to be the sex slave to, essentially. Euripides makes a point of writing in there because the audience knew exactly where these women were going because they knew the stories like the back of their hand. So we know that Cassandra is going back with Agamemnon. We know who's going with who. Sorry, I'm gonna say that again. The Greek audience knew these stories like the back of their hands. They knew which woman was going where. So, as an example, let's use Andromache because she's going back with Neoptolemus. He is the son of Achilles who has killed her husband Hector. So that adds a layer of pathos. So the audience know where these women are going because Euripides is making an adaptation. He's not making the story up. He's got to work with the events as they happened. But he makes a point of each woman says, I really hope I get to go to Athens. If I have to go anywhere as a sex slave, let it be Athens. They're wonderful. They're not as bad as the rest of them. I want to go to Athens, which is ridiculous because Athens barely pops up in the Iliad at all.
Well, never let facts get in the way of a good story or the need to shamelessly self-promote, right?
Exactly.
Closing out the podcast episode here, tell us where we can find you online and on the social media accounts. Where can we find you and interact with you?
So I'm mainly on Blue Sky these days because Twitter is a hellhole. And you can find
Fact
me
check
at
comes back true on that one.
yeah, it's really lovely that Blue Sky exists. So you can find me there at Beloved of Voices. I'm also on Instagram. I have a website, ancientalexandra.co.uk. And the podcast, of course, you can find me at Ancient History 101. So I am online chronically.
Give us a book recommendation, a good book to read. It can be any book of any type, doesn't have to be history, just any good book to read.
We've been talking about Homeric epic, so I can't not mention this book. It is fantastic. A friend of mine, Laura Jenkinson Brown, has written an adventure of the Odyssey where you get to, we can't use the term choose your own adventure because that is copyrighted,
Correct.
but it is a book where you can choose where Odysseus goes, the decisions that he makes. So you start off in Troy. Are you going to make it home to Ithaca? Are you going to be able to withstand the temptresses? Are you going to fall foul of the monsters? your decision making will decide whether or not you're going to be successful. You might do a better job, you might do a worse job. It is fantastic the amount of detail that Laura has been able to put into this book, which is called You Are Odysseus. And actually, for a student's point of view, it's perfect because it really does help you think about the decision making that Odysseus makes in the Homeric epic. We've got the benefit of hindsight is 2020. Odysseus obviously doesn't. He doesn't know what's waiting for him. So we've got to try and put ourselves in the shoes of, is he making a good decision? Could I make a better one? It's so much fun. I died so many times though.
Do you have the option not to fall asleep at every key moment in time, like the goober that Odysseus is? I'm sorry, I have a very negative view of him as I was reading it. I just said, this guy, he's just clearly some sort of satirical discussion of uh, whatever was going on back then about the wars and the ruling class and what have you. I mean, I think uh, Amy, who was on the podcast, and I decided that he was the first keeping it real guy.
Yeah.
Hence all the problems that he got into. So anyway, but that just my thoughts on Odysseus.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. You can turn your Odysseus into anyone you want him to be, which, if you think that he's a bit of a loser, you can change him completely.
Well, we'll see what Matt Damon does for the character.
Yeah.
I am looking forward to that movie because I do like Christopher Nolan movies. Dunkirk was phenomenal. I've only seen it once. I need to watch it again. But of course, it's the Batman movies and Memento. Just put he's done some really really good movies. So, give us a future podcast episode idea.
Oh, for you, that's a good one. I think I would go with an anything that kind of continues the idea of cultural exchange between the Greeks and the Romans. I do get frustrated by the siloing. So I would love any episode of the Romans adopting Greek culture or Greeks living under Roman hegemony, something like that, that just gives us more of the overlap. I think we all need more overlap in our lives.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. If you want to find us online, go to the socials at Antiquity Pod for most of them. You can go to our website, classicalantiquitypod.com. You can call the podcast 540-632-0160. Ask a question, leave a comment. You will get on the air. If you have a question, either I will answer it or perhaps one of our guests will answer it. But again, call. We'd appreciate it. The theme music is by Brent Earhart. And stay tuned, folks. There are more episodes coming. I have to keep doing this because, as you know, the Classical Antiquity Sidequest is a podcast without end.